I had just come back to my small hometown in Ohio after working overseas for a month, trying to feel better after a long flight and hoping everything at home was still okay. But the moment I walked inside, I could feel something was wrong. I am Dana, 34, and it only took a few steps down the hallway for a scary feeling to hit me. During the past month, every time I called to check on my parents, my older brother always picked up the phone before they could, and his rushed voice didn't sound like his usual calm self. I told myself he was just stressed or having a bad day, but the worried feeling stayed with me all the way through the airport and into this very moment. I walked toward the back door to bring in the last of my bags when I noticed it wasn't completely closed. A small breeze came through the opening. Out in the yard, the storage room had a thick metal lock on it that I had never seen before. That strange lock made my arms feel tight with worry. I grabbed a small metal tool from the toolbox and forced the lock open because something inside me told me I needed to see what was behind that door. What I saw inside made my voice shake as I called out for help. My parents were sitting in the corner, tired, scared, and barely able to stand up. When I asked what had happened, their shaking voices said only one name. The same name that had been answering my phone calls for weeks. I called for emergency help with shaking hands. And within minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the driveway with lights cutting through the dark as everything I believed about my family began to fall apart. If you want to follow what truly happened after this moment, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of the story. Your support helps us bring more powerful real-life stories. At the hospital, I realized the situation was much worse than I thought. The workers hurried my parents into a room and began checking them with a seriousness that made me grow nervous. I followed closely behind them, and every step down the hallway felt heavier as the bright lights showed the tired look on their faces. Mom could barely keep her eyes open, while Dad's breathing sounded weak in a way that scared me more than I expected. When a nurse asked me to wait outside for a moment, I felt helpless because I realized I had no idea how long they had been suffering before I opened that storage room door. A few minutes later, a doctor came into the waiting area and asked me to follow him to a quieter corner of the hallway. His face looked calm but serious as he explained that both my mother and my father didn't have enough water in their bodies, were very weak, and showed signs of being locked up for a long time. The way he described what was wrong with them made my stomach feel sick, because it meant someone who had access to our home during my trip had not taken care of them. I listened carefully as he continued, and although he spoke patiently, every detail made the pain in my chest grow. He told me they were okay for now, but needed to be watched, given fluids, and needed rest after what seemed to be a long time without proper care or freedom to move around. I stood quietly for a moment before one of the officers came over and asked if they could speak with me. The older officer introduced himself politely and asked for information about my family, including any recent fights or strange behavior. That was the moment I said my brother's name for the first time, telling them that my brother Marcus had been answering my calls for weeks and had told me several times that I didn't need to come home early from my work trip. As the officer wrote down notes, I realized how weird those phone calls had felt when I thought back on them. Whenever I asked to speak with Mom or Dad, Marcus always said they were resting or busy, and he found ways to end the call quickly. I had brushed it off at the time, thinking he was stressed. But now, being questioned, every memory felt suspicious. When the officers asked where Marcus was at that moment, I could only say that I had no idea. I hadn't seen him at the house when I arrived, and his car had been missing from the driveway. The officers looked at each other briefly before stepping aside to use their radio, and the serious tone in their voices made my heart beat faster. I tried to stay focused while another officer asked about our recent family life, but my mind wandered to the strange excuses Marcus had given whenever I mentioned coming home earlier. He always said he had everything under control, although he never explained what he meant by that. A nurse finally called me back into the room where Mom and Dad were resting. Seeing them connected to tubes that gave them fluids made me feel even more guilty. I had been thousands of miles away trusting Marcus to check on them while I worked overseas. That trust now felt like a terrible mistake. I sat beside them and held Mom's hand, gently trying to calm my breathing. The more I looked at them, the more determined I became to find out the truth, even if the answers were worse than anything I had imagined. Work responsibilities, deadlines, and everything else faded from my mind as a single promise formed. Nothing would come before their safety again. I needed to understand what Marcus had done, and I needed to make sure my parents would never face something like this in the future. The next morning arrived quietly as I drove back to the house with a determination that calmed my nerves and pushed away the tiredness still left from the long night. I parked in the driveway and stepped out with a sense of purpose, trying to understand what had truly happened while I was gone. As I walked toward the back gate, a voice called my name with a worried tone that made me turn right away. It was the neighbor who lives next door, Mrs. Helen Brooks, standing near her porch with a worried look that seemed to grow deeper the moment our eyes met. I walked toward her, and she held her hands together as if gathering the courage to speak. Helen took a small breath before telling me she had noticed strange activity around my place for several days, especially near the storage room where my parents were found. She explained that she often sits by her kitchen window in the evenings and had seen Marcus walking back and forth between the house and the small storage building at times that didn't make sense for any normal task. The way she described his hurried steps and nervous looks made the back of my neck feel tight. Helen reached for her phone with a hesitant sigh, saying she needed to show me something that had been bothering her since last week. She opened the doorbell camera app and pulled up a series of videos she had saved. The first clip showed Marcus carrying a heavy cardboard box across the yard while looking around with a tense look on his face. His movements looked strained, and he didn't try to hide the fact that he was heading straight toward the storage room. Another clip showed him coming back much later in the night with another container that looked even heavier than the first. His shoulders were hunched, and there was a strange rush in the way he pushed open the gate. I watched each clip with a tightening chest, trying to calm my breathing as the pieces began forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Helen said sorry for not stepping in sooner, explaining that she wasn't sure whether what she saw was serious or simply a private family matter. I told her she had done the right thing by speaking up, although the reassurance felt empty when my mind was already racing toward darker possibilities. There was something planned in Marcus' behavior, something far more troubling than the usual careless decisions he had made in the past. The final clip showed Marcus leaving the property with his backpack on one shoulder while dragging a small suitcase behind him. His body language was tense, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to stop him. The timestamp showed his departure was less than a day before I came home. That detail made my stomach twist as I realized how closely our schedules had lined up without us seeing each other. Whatever he was planning, he had done it carefully enough to avoid facing me. Once the last clip ended, I felt determination settle inside me. I thanked Helen for showing me the videos, then stepped away to call the main officer handling the investigation. My voice stayed steady as I explained what I had seen and sent the files for them to look at. The officer said the videos would be added to the case and looked at right away. I ended the call with a deep breath that didn't loosen the tightness in my chest. As I walked back toward the house, I tried to make sense of the growing feeling that Marcus might be hiding money problems big enough to push him into dangerous decisions. He had avoided my calls during the last month and brushed off my attempts to check in before the trip. His eagerness to handle everything alone had seemed strange at the time, but now the strangeness felt like something darker. The more I replayed his rushed voice and avoiding answers in my mind, the clearer it became that something had been falling apart long before I came home. By the afternoon, I walked into the backyard with a growing determination to understand what had been happening behind my parents' silence. I started going through each corner slowly, letting the quiet of the yard guide me toward anything that might have been missed during the chaos of the night before. The air carried a tension that pushed me to look deeper into the small details Marcus had always thought no one would question. I walked up to the trash bins with a hesitation that quickly shifted into purpose, and I forced myself to look through each layer of thrown-away items until something caught my attention under a bundle of torn envelopes. What I found was a crumpled receipt from a local pawn shop near the edge of town, and the moment I unfolded it, my stomach tightened. The signature near the bottom was written in a shaky copy of my father's name, a shape that showed an uneasy mix of effort and dishonesty. I stared at the ink for several seconds before the realization settled further into my thoughts. There was no way Dad would have walked into a pawn shop without telling me, and the date on the receipt placed the transaction right in the middle of the time I had been away on my work trip. The item listed was valuable enough to suggest desperation, or a growing pattern of behavior I hadn't noticed until now. Under the receipt sat a small folded note written on an old piece of lined paper. The message had a single phrase stating a large amount written in words rather than numbers, something that showed someone had tried to hide the true size of the debt. The handwriting didn't belong to either of my parents, and the uneven strokes suggested a rushed attempt to keep track of the growing debt. My mind connected the pieces faster than I could manage my own worry. Marcus had been in and out of the house for months, moving with a restless energy that never felt settled. Now, the story behind his behavior began to form into a picture that was far more troubling than the arguments he had tried to avoid. I took photos of both documents, holding the papers steady to make sure the proof would be clear for the officers who had already been waiting for updates. After sending everything through their secure contact, I got a message back that the materials were being looked at by their Financial Crimes Division. The change in tone from the officers showed that these findings were no longer considered a simple family fight, but had grown into a case needing immediate investigation. As I stood in the fading afternoon light, I replayed the last few conversations I had shared with Marcus before leaving the country. He had brushed off my questions about his workload, his spending habits, and the tension that often appeared whenever topics of responsibility came up. The avoiding answers made far more sense now, and the truth behind his actions settled into my thoughts with an unsettling clarity. The idea that he had used my parents' identities to get loans or pawn valuable belongings without permission created a weight that pressed harder against my chest. I closed the lid of the trash bin and stepped back, no longer confused, but driven by a need to protect Mom and Dad from more harm. There was no room left for hesitation, and I knew the investigation had only begun to uncover the reality he had tried to bury. 2 days later, the police contacted me with new information that they believed could change the direction of their investigation in a big way. I drove to the station with a sense of controlled urgency, trying to prepare myself for whatever they had found since the day I gave them the documents from the backyard. When I arrived, an officer greeted me and led me to a quiet room where several folders had already been arranged in a neat stack, clearly showing that the team had spent a lot of time looking at each piece of proof found during the search. The officer explained that their overnight work had led them to a small apartment rented by Marcus under a separate lease that didn't involve any family details, which made it hard for them to find earlier. The unit had been located through a financial cross-check that flagged repeated payments connected to an address no one recognized. Once they got a warrant and entered the apartment, they found a messy desk drawer holding several envelopes, loose documents, and a silver USB drive marked only by a small square of tape. The storage device became their priority, and after looking at what was on it, they asked me to come right away. The officer opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. Inside the USB, there were scanned copies of documents that looked like legal permissions. One file showed a fake signature meant to look like Mom's, giving full access to bank accounts that had been unused for years. Another file used Dad's name in a fake authorization that tried to transfer property rights. The officer stressed that the documents were not only fake, but carefully made to look like real paperwork, which meant Marcus had prepared them with a plan that went beyond a moment of desperation. I felt a steady pressure form in my chest as each file loaded on the screen. The officer paused sometimes to give me time to take in the information and to avoid overwhelming me with details. Although the shock was real, I forced myself to focus because understanding the scope of what Marcus had built was important for protecting Mom and Dad from more harm. The officer then told me that they had found a list of bank accounts connected to suspicious withdrawals. Those withdrawals lined up with the fake papers stored in the USB, creating a chain of proof strong enough to justify expanding the investigation. Before I left the station, another officer came up and told me that someone had come forward on their own. It was a friend of Marcus named Sean who had offered information once he realized the situation was getting worse. When Sean sat with the investigators, he admitted that Marcus had been drowning in private debts that he tried to hide from everyone. According to Sean, those debts had grown so fast that Marcus began searching for ways to get money quickly, even if those methods crossed ethical or legal limits. Sean said he had tried to distance himself once he understood how risky Marcus' decisions were becoming. But guilt eventually pushed him to speak up. I walked out of the station with a mix of clarity and heaviness. Every new discovery felt like another door closing behind me. Yet, I knew each step brought me closer to protecting my parents and understanding what had driven Marcus into such dangerous choices. 1 week later, I got the call I had been waiting for since the moment my parents were taken to the hospital. The officer on the line told me they had finally found Marcus at a small motel in a neighboring town. Hearing his name spoken with that level of certainty created a strange mix of relief and dread across my chest. I drove to the station with a steady pace because I needed to be there when they brought him in. I was tired of imagining where he might be hiding or what he might be planning, and I wanted answers given directly. When I arrived, the atmosphere in the hallway showed that something important had taken place. An officer came up to me and explained that Marcus had been found alone in a room he had rented under a different name. The room had a few bags that were packed in a hurry along with a bus ticket scheduled to leave the next morning. There was also a notebook with several pages showing a possible route that would take him far from Ohio. The plan looked rushed, but still showed he had been searching for ways to avoid facing the consequences of everything that had happened. They walked Marcus into an interview room, and I was given the chance to speak to him before the formal questioning began. Seeing him in person again was unsettling because he seemed smaller than I remembered, and yet there was still a defensive sharpness in his eyes. He looked at me with a mix of irritation and exhaustion, as if I had disrupted a plan he believed he could still control. I sat down across from him and waited for him to speak first. After a long moment, he leaned forward and said the same line he had repeated whenever he wanted to avoid responsibility throughout our childhood. He said, "I just needed time to fix everything." The words sounded almost practiced, as if he believed that explanation could erase the pain my parents had gone through or justify locking them away so he could use their identities without anyone noticing. I took a breath before responding because I wanted my words to be calm and clear. I looked him in the eyes and said, "You are never fixing anything. You were only running from what you caused." His face tightened for a moment, and I could see the brief flicker of frustration because he finally understood that whatever excuse he had prepared wouldn't work this time. The officer standing nearby stepped closer and added, "This situation is no longer something you can talk your way out of." They moved him from the room so the formal processing could begin, and I stepped out into the hallway to gather myself. Another officer came over to tell me that the motel room had additional documents related to financial activity they were still looking at. Those findings would be added to the list of charges that were being prepared with the help of the prosecutor. The officer explained that the prosecutor had already begun putting together the case because of the seriousness of the fake documents and the confinement my parents had gone through. Later that afternoon, I visited the hospital to check on Mom and Dad. Mom was gaining more strength each day and looked more present than she had during those first scary hours. Dad had gotten back more clarity and asked questions with a steadier voice, which gave me a sense of grounding after such a wild morning. I updated them on the arrest and promised them the investigation was moving forward with purpose. When I left the hospital, I felt the beginning of a shift inside myself. The arrest didn't erase the pain nor the confusion, but it marked the first moment when the truth finally stood in the open instead of hiding in the shadows Marcus had created. 1 month later, the trial officially began. A quiet tension surrounded me as I walked into the courthouse and took my seat among the early attendees. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over my shoulders, and although I tried to calm my breath, the hushed conversations in the room served as a reminder of the seriousness of what was about to happen. I watched officers walk Marcus into the courtroom while he kept his eyes down, and the sight forced a complicated mix of anger and sadness through me. The judge entered soon after, and the room stood up before sitting down again. The prosecutor began outlining the charges against Marcus, which included unlawful confinement, making fake legal records, and elder exploitation. I listened as each accusation was presented with supporting proof collected over the past weeks. The prosecutor detailed the fake documents found in the apartment he had rented, including the USB that held the fake authorization meant to redirect my parents' money. I knew these facts well, yet hearing them spoken out loud in a courtroom created a deeper ache. I realized that the damage he caused went beyond money because he had disrupted the safety of 2 people who trusted him without hesitation. When the prosecutor called the first witness, I folded my hands and focused on every word. Sean, a friend of Marcus, stepped toward the stand. This was the first time I had seen him in person, and although his face showed discomfort, he answered the questions without hesitation. He described multiple conversations in which Marcus admitted he was overwhelmed by debt. He also remembered moments when Marcus mentioned his plan to take control of my parents' accounts because he believed he could manage them better. His testimony made the atmosphere more intense because it clarified intention rather than impulse. Helen was called next. She told about the evenings when she noticed Marcus going to the storage building behind our home during unusual hours. She also mentioned the day she looked at her doorbell footage and noticed him carrying sealed boxes toward the same area. Her voice stayed steady as she explained the timeline. I appreciated her presence because she had been honest from the beginning, and her willingness to speak reinforced the reliability of what she had witnessed. The prosecutor eventually said my name, and I moved toward the stand while trying to stay composed. I felt my pulse pick up when I faced the courtroom. The questions focused on the discovery of my parents, the documents I found in the backyard trash, and the emotional impact of what had happened. I answered clearly because there was no room for uncertainty. When the prosecutor asked whether I believed reconciliation with Marcus was possible, I paused before responding. The room waited in silence and all of us to breathe again. I moved Mom and Dad to a quieter neighborhood that offered better support services and a level of security that gave me the reassurance I had been craving ever since the investigation began. Mom got back her strength slowly, while Dad got back enough clarity to recognize familiar routines and enjoy small comforts that had once been overshadowed by constant fear. I spent more time at home because I wanted them to feel anchored in a space where safety was no longer a fragile promise. Helen continued to visit carrying the warm energy that had helped us get through the darkest moments. She brought small treats, neighborhood updates, and stories light enough to ease the tension that still stayed in our home. Her steady presence reminded me that relationships built on kindness can grow just as meaningful as those formed by blood, and sometimes they become even stronger when tested through hardship. One morning, a letter with Marcus' handwriting arrived in my mailbox. He wrote that he wanted to be understood, not forgiven, and that he had never meant to harm our parents. He claimed he had acted under pressure and had been overwhelmed by choices that spiraled out of control. The letter held no real accountability, only a quiet plea for recognition. I read every word, folded the page, and placed it in a drawer that I didn't lock. I never responded. My silence was not an act of punishment, but a boundary that I needed to hold. Trust cannot be rebuilt through a single confession written after everything has already been lost. Our days eventually became calmer. I took Mom on gentle walks through the garden behind our new home, and Dad sometimes hummed along to melodies he had loved for years. These simple moments gave me a sense of closure that no verdict or sentence ever could. They reminded me that family can survive deep wounds, but true protection requires the courage to draw lines that keep harm from returning. I learned that the deepest pain often comes from those who once held our trust without effort. Marcus' actions forced me to accept that love within a family doesn't erase responsibility. Care must be matched with respect, and boundaries must be honored even among relatives. Protecting the people we love sometimes requires stepping away from someone who chooses harm, and choosing peace over loyalty is not betrayal when safety is at stake. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Sharing these moments has not been easy yet. I hope they offered something meaningful for anyone dealing with complex family situations. If this experience stirred any thoughts or reflections, I would be grateful to hear them. Feel free to share your perspective so we can continue the conversation with empathy and understanding.